The waves were rough that afternoon. People stood frozen on the sand as a woman vanished beneath the water, pulled under by something stronger than panic. One man didn't hesitate. Shoes abandoned, breath held. He ran straight into the ocean as others watched. By the time he reached her, she was barely conscious, her body sinking fast. Someone on the shore shouted, "She's not coming, back up!" He dragged her out anyway, saved her life, then did something no one expected. He walked away without asking her name. What he didn't know was that this moment would follow him and cost him far more than silence ever did. Comment and tell us what you think you would have done in that moment. And subscribe for stories that expose truths many try to ignore. Marcus lived by routines because routines kept chaos away. Every morning started the same early alarm, quiet apartment, his daughter Aaliyah still asleep as he packed lunch with one hand and checked the clock with the other. Marcus Hill had learned that consistency was the only thing life couldn't take from him without a fight. Work was invisible but demanding. The lower floors of the building never made headlines, yet nothing functioned without them. Marcus kept his head down, fixed problems before anyone noticed them, and left no room for misunderstanding. He had seen what happened when black men were noticed for the wrong reasons. Leonard Brooks had once worked beside him, smart, reliable, until a small accusation turned into a sudden termination no one questioned. At home, Aaliyah was his anchor. 7 years old, observant, quieter than children her age. Her questions came softly, like she didn't want to burden him. Her mother, Rachel Collins, was no longer part of their daily life, not from lack of love, but from pressure that slowly pulled their marriage apart. Above Marcus's world was another one entirely. Evelyn Whitmore lived in meetings, numbers, and decisions that shaped thousands of lives without touching them personally. Power followed her everywhere, but real connection never did. People wanted access, never honesty. After the ocean, Marcus expected life to reset. It didn't. The building felt different. Eyes lingered. Whispers replaced silence. Kevin Miller smiled too easily in the break room, the kind of smile that carried assumptions instead of words. "One afternoon," someone muttered. Funny how some people get lucky. Marcus understood the warning. Gratitude could turn into suspicion. Survival could become a liability. And he knew one truth already. Whatever was coming next wouldn't stay contained to the water. After the rescue, Marcus tried to disappear back into routine. Same early mornings, same quiet hallways, same discipline that had kept his life stable for years. But routine no longer worked. Something had shifted the moment he walked away from the ocean, and the building felt it before he did. The lower floors began to hum with curiosity. Not open questions. Those would have required honesty, but glances that lingered too long. Conversations that stopped when Marcus walked past. He felt it in the pauses, in the way his name suddenly carried weight it never had before. Gratitude was supposed to fade. Instead, it followed him. Evelyn struggled in a different way. She returned to word change, not outwardly, but internally. Meetings blurred together. Numbers lost their sharpness. She kept replaying the same image. A man who had no idea who she was, pulling her from the water and leaving without hesitation. No calculation, no expectation. That kind of kindness made her uncomfortable because it couldn't be repaid or controlled. Inside the company, the overlap became unavoidable. Marcus was pulled into discussions he had never been invited to before. Not promotions, not recognition, just proximity. And proximity, in places like this, always came with a price. Kevin watched closely. He didn't accuse. He didn't confront. He joked. Jokes were safer. Jokes carried messages without consequences. One afternoon, as Marcus walked past the break room, Kevin leaned back in his chair and said loudly enough for others to hear, "Must be nice getting noticed all of a sudden." The room went still. No one laughed. No one corrected him. Silence did the work. Marcus said nothing. He never did. But that night, at home, Aaliyah Hill noticed the change. She sat at the kitchen table coloring while he stared at the wall longer than necessary. She asked quietly, "Dad, D-I-D-I-D-I, something wrong?" The question hit harder than any insult at work. He assured her everything was fine, knowing the lie would only grow heavier with time. The whispers grew bolder. Someone suggested he had timed it right. Another implied opportunity had a way of finding people who knew how to use it. Marcus remembered Leonard Brooks, how fast the system had turned on him, how easily doubt became evidence when the target was already convenient. Evelyn sensed it too. She noticed the way conversation shifted when Marcus entered a room. She recognized the pattern because she had benefited from it her entire career power, protecting itself by deciding who deserved suspicion. For the first time, she was forced to confront how her presence alone could distort someone else's life. She tried to pull back. Fewer meetings, less visibility. But distance didn't undo what had already started. Instead, it allowed others to fill the gaps with their own stories. One afternoon, Marcus overheard it directly. A voice behind him, careless and sharp, muttered, "He saving her for a reason. People don't do things like that for free." The words stayed with him long after the hallway emptied. They weren't about the rescue. They were about permission, the permission people felt to decide who he was without asking. At home, pressure stacked. Rachel called more often, her concern wrapped tightly around fear. She spoke about stability, about risk, about how fragile everything already was. Marcus listened until she finally said, "You can't afford to be seen right now." That was the truth everyone avoided. Visibility wasn't neutral. It was dangerous. Meanwhile, Evelyn faced her own reckoning. She realized silence wasn't neutrality. It was alignment. Every hour she said nothing. The story hardened around Marcus. The system she ran so efficiently was doing what it had always done, protect itself by isolating the most vulnerable person in the room. The tension finally broke in a closed-door meeting meant to feel routine. Marcus was questioned, not directly, but carefully, framed as concern, as policy, as protection. The implication hung heavy in the air until Evelyn finally spoke, her voice sharper than anyone expected. "This conversation is about fear, not facts." The room froze. Authority had shifted just enough to make people uncomfortable. Marcus left that meeting knowing one thing: silence was no longer an option. The story had grown teeth, and whatever came next wouldn't stay quiet, controlled, or private. Because once suspicion is spoken out loud, it doesn't disappear. It demands an ending. The confrontation didn't come with warning. It arrived, disguised as procedure, wrapped in professionalism, and delivered at the worst possible moment. Marcus was called into a meeting late in the afternoon when most of the building was still busy enough to pretend nothing was happening. The room was glass-walled, visible without being accessible, the kind of space designed to make silence feel official. He could feel it before anyone spoke. The shift in air, the careful posture, the decision already forming. This wasn't about clarity. It was about control. Evelyn sat at the far end of the table, composed but alert. She wasn't the target, but she wasn't invisible either. Others spoke first. Concerns were raised, policies referenced, words chosen to sound neutral while cutting deep. Marcus listened, standing still, knowing every movement would be read twice. Then it was said out loud. Not shouted, not whispered, just placed on the table like evidence. "We need to address the appearance of improper motives." The sentence landed hard. It didn't accuse directly. It didn't need to. Everyone understood what it implied. The rescue, the proximity, the suspicion that followed black men the moment gratitude became visibility. Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the warning sign he had ignored for too long. He thought of his daughter waiting at home, of the promise he made every morning to keep her safe, of how easily that promise could be shattered by a story he didn't write. He spoke, voice steady, louder than he planned. "I saved a life. That's it." The room didn't respond. Silence pressed in, thick and deliberate. This was the moment systems relied on, the pause where doubt could grow. Someone shifted in their seat. Someone else glanced toward the door, already calculating distance. Then Kevin leaned forward, confidence sharpened by the room's quiet. "Let's not pretend this wasn't convenient." That was the spark, not because it was new, but because it was public. The sentence gave everyone permission to believe the worst version of Marcus without saying his name again. Phones buzzed outside the room. Movement slowed in the hallway. People sensed something unfolding. Marcus felt anger rise, hot and dangerous. He could swallow it like he always had, or he could refuse. Evelyn stood. The sound of her chair scraping back cut through the tension. She looked around the room, not with authority alone, but with clarity. The kind that comes when silence stops being an option. "This ends now." The words carried weight, Not because she was angry, but because she was done pretending neutrality wasn't a choice. She laid it out without cushioning. The rescue was verified, the timeline clear, the accusations baseless. What remained wasn't concern, it was fear. Fear of optics, fear of disruption, fear of a black man refusing to stay small. She turned toward Marcus, then back to the room. What you're doing is racism, hiding behind policy. No one interrupted. No one could. The room had shifted, not softly, not gradually. Power didn't disappear, but it cracked, and cracks let light in whether systems want them to or not. Outside, a small crowd had formed, not to watch a scandal, but to witness something rarer, truth spoken where it wasn't expected. Marcus felt the weight lift just enough to breathe. Not relief, resolve. He knew this moment wouldn't fix everything. He knew consequences would follow. But something irreversible had happened. The story written about him no longer belonged to them. As the meeting ended, Marcus walked out first, shoulders squared, eyes forward. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Because once injustice is named out loud, it can't pretend it was invisible. And whatever came next would have to face that truth head on. Marcus went home that night carrying more than exhaustion. The apartment was quiet. The kind of quiet that settles after something permanent has shifted. Aaliyah was already asleep on the couch, her school bag still at her feet, like she had been waiting without realizing it. He covered her with a blanket and stood there longer than usual, watching her breathe, grounding himself in the simple truth that she was safe. Work didn't return to normal. It couldn't. The investigation ended quietly, without apologies or announcements, but the outcome was clear. Marcus was transferred to a separate division across the city. Same role, same pay, no promotion, no punishment. The distance removed the hierarchy that had poisoned the narrative, and for the first time since the ocean, his name stopped circulating like a warning. Evelyn made the decision publicly and deliberately, not as a favor, not as damage control, as accountability. She didn't try to soften it. She understood now that silence had been part of the problem, and choosing clarity was the only way forward. At home, the change showed up in smaller ways. Aaliyah slept through the night. She asked questions again. She laughed without checking his face first. One evening, as they walked through the park, she looked up and said, You didn't let them lie about you." Marcus stopped walking, not because the words surprised him, but because they mattered. His daughter had seen him stand without anger, without violence, without disappearing. That was the inheritance he had almost lost. This wasn't a victory story. Systems didn't collapse. Racism didn't vanish. It adjusted, like it always does. But something had been interrupted, a pattern exposed. A man refused to carry shame that didn't belong to him. And a child learned that dignity doesn't come from staying quiet. The truth is, moments like this happen every day. Most never reach the surface. Most end in silence. The question is simple and uncomfortable. How many lies are shaped by stories that were never allowed to be corrected? If this story stayed with you, don't let it stop here. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to Black Community Struggles for stories that speak when silence is expected.